I want you to picture something for a second. Imagine you're doing something completely mundane today. Maybe you're sitting at your computer booking an airline ticket for a trip next month.
Or maybe
Or,
you're just running out to pick up groceries.
exactly, picking up groceries or sitting down at the kitchen table to pay your monthly electricity bill. Now imagine that the exact price you are paying for those everyday things was actually decided hours ago by a rumor thousands of miles away.
Right, in a narrow strip of water you might never even visit.
It is, well, it's a profound realization when you see how connected those passing daily moments actually are to global geography.
Oh, absolutely. We just go about our routines completely insulated from the physical systems that make them possible.
Welcome to today's deep dive. Our mission today is to unpack the fascinating outsized global influence of the Strait of Hormuz. We're looking at it not just as a geopolitical hotspot you hear about on the news, but as this hidden invisible valve that dictates the cost of living for absolutely everyone.
And to do that, we have pulled together an incredibly intricate stack of analysis.
We really have. We are drawing insights today from the New York Times, Reuters, Al Jazeera, CNBC, the Council on Foreign Relations, Control Risks, and the U.S. Energy Information Administration.
And just to set the ground rules before we open this up, the intelligence and reporting we're looking at today touches on some highly charged ongoing escalations involving Iran, the United States, and Israel.
Right, very sensitive stuff.
Extremely. So to be clear to you listening, we aren't taking political sides or endorsing any policies today. Our mission is strictly to pull the curtain back on the mechanics to show you how these massive global systems react when put under intense pressure based on the sources we have.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to really understand the Strait of Hormuz, we have to look past the map. On most days, this waterway is just background infrastructure. You probably don't think about it.
No, most people don't.
But fundamentally, as the security analysis points out, it is one of the world's most consequential single points of failure. It's this incredibly narrow gateway linking the Persian Gulf to the wider ocean.
Its strategic power comes entirely from that unforgiving geography.
Right.
I mean, it is a very small piece of navigable water that concentrates an enormous amount of economic value into a space that is, relatively speaking, easy to threaten, but exceptionally difficult to fully secure.
Right.
We're talking about millions of barrels of oil and massive volumes of natural gas passing through a choke point that is only about 21 miles wide at its narrowest point.
Yeah.
And the actual shipping lanes themselves are even narrower than that.
There was a framing in the financial reporting from CNBC that totally shifts how you perceive it. They suggest you shouldn't even picture it as a geographic place.
Yeah, I love that part.
Right. Instead, picture it as a function. Imagine it as a valve on a massive set of pipes that feeds global energy demand. When that valve turns even just a fraction of a degree, global markets react instantly.
Instantly. Because our modern economy relies entirely on continuous flow and totally predictable delivery schedules. The risk analysis data from Control Risks expands on that beautifully. They point out that in energy terms, Hormuz is a system, not just a single shipping lane. We tend to just picture giant oil tankers floating through water, almost like autonomous islands.
Just big ships doing their thing.
Right. But the reality is a massive interconnected mesh of dependencies. You are talking about fleets of tugboats, incredibly complex port operations, local river pilots who navigate the tightest turns,
The logistics are wild.
and satellite communication networks, delicate ship-to-ship, transfers, mountains of legal paperwork, and critically maritime insurance underwriting. It is an entire ecosystem where if one piece hesitates, the whole chain stalls.
But let's say someone listening to this right now lives in a country that produces its own energy, say the United States or parts of Europe with heavy renewables. They might be thinking, my local grid doesn't rely on Middle Eastern oil, so why does this valve matter to me?
That is the most common misconception. The reporting makes it clear that even if your country is a massive domestic energy producer, you are still directly affected. Oil is priced globally, it is shipped globally, and, maybe most importantly, it is treated globally from a psychological standpoint.
You don't buy American oil or Asian oil at the gas station.
Exactly, you are buying the marginal barrel.
Let's define that for a second, because marginal barrel gets thrown around in financial news a lot.
It's a crucial concept.
Mm.
It means the price isn't based on the cheapest oil sitting in a local tank down the street from you. It's based on the cost of the very last, most expensive barrel needed to meet global demand on any given day.
Ah, so it sets the ceiling.
Right. If the Strait of Hormuz tightens, the global supply shrinks. Buyers all over the world suddenly scramble to secure the remaining barrels, bidding up the price everywhere. So that marginal barrel is essentially priced by the global market's collective fear level at that exact moment.
Which leads into the big question everyone always asks when tensions rise. Could the strait be closed completely? Going through the source material, you realize that full closure isn't actually the point.
No, not at all.
The real weapon here isn't a physical blockade. The real weapon is friction.
What's fascinating here is a concept the analysts call the uncertainty tax. As you noted, a full closure is a dramatic movie plot idea. But the economically interesting part is the middle zone between open and closed.
That gray area.
Exactly. It is a zone of pure economic anxiety. In practice, the vulnerability of the strait shows up as a gradient. We start seeing higher war risk premiums from insurers.
And those premiums aren't just a minor administrative fee, right?
Not at all. A war risk premium is an extra charge added to a ship's insurance when it sails into a designated high-risk area. We are talking about sudden spikes that can add hundreds of thousands of dollars to a single voyage overnight.
Just for one trip.
Yes. When those premiums jump, ship owners start making overly cautious routing choices. They decide to wait outside the Gulf. That leads to longer wait times, tighter availability of vessels globally, and this slow but constantly compounding effect of uncertainty that bleeds into the price of everything.
The Council on Foreign Relations brings a really out-of-the-box framing to this entire dynamic. They suggest looking at the Strait of Hormuz as a continuous geopolitical options market.
I thought that was a brilliant comparison.
Me too. In the financial world, an options market is constantly pricing in future risks and placing bets on what might happen. At Hormuz, the geopolitical actors are doing the exact same thing with military posturing. Iran's option is their ability to raise the cost of shipping and energy simply by increasing the perceived risk.
They don't have to sink a ship, they just have to make the market believe they might.
Right, and looking at the other side of the board, the U.S. option is the ability to reduce that perceived risk through naval protection and signaling an overwhelming response.
Meanwhile, Israel's option in this dynamic is the ability to widen or narrow the scope of the broader conflict, which in turn alters the global risk perceptions. The market is continuously pricing those options every second of the day through crude oil benchmarks, freight rates, and insurance premiums.
So no one actually needs to formally close the strait to achieve their goals. The system is stressed even while the ships are physically still passing through on a random Tuesday afternoon.
Which creates what our sources identify as three major paradoxes of deterrence in this region. The first is deterrence at sea. The U.S. and its partners try to show resolve and preserve freedom of navigation.
But they have to be careful.
Right, they have to do so without triggering a spiral of escalation that causes the very market panic they are trying to prevent. Firing weapons to protect a shipping lane can sometimes make the shipping lane look too dangerous for commercial vessels to use anyway.
The cure causes the symptom.
Precisely. The second paradox is Iran's self-constraint. The regional reporting from Al Jazeera and others highlights that while threatening the strait creates immense leverage, an actual sustained closure would completely devastate Iran's own economy and political stability.
It would choke off their own exports.
Yes, and provoke overwhelming international pushback. The goal is not to lock the gate. The goal is to make the gate expensive.
Make the gate expensive. I like that. And the third paradox seems to tie back to what we discussed about the marginal barrel.
That is the indirect exposure of the U.S. and Israel. Neither country needs to import the majority of their oil from the Gulf to suffer deeply from a disruption there.
Because the market is totally connected.
Exactly. Because the price mechanism is completely global. A localized, distant conflict hits domestic voters incredibly hard through inflation and economic anxiety. You could have total energy independence on paper and still face a massive domestic crisis because global prices spiked.
There was a piece of analysis in the New York Times stack that completely reframed this for me. They argued we should stop looking at Hormuz as just an energy corridor and start looking at it as an information corridor.
That changes everything.
It really does. In a crisis, the markets don't just respond to what is physically happening, they respond to what they believe is happening. So rumors of rerouted tankers, or a grainy, out-of-context video posted on social media, or an ambiguous statement from a government official.
Those pieces of information can move global markets just as violently as naval mines.
Yes. Narrative itself becomes a weapon.
Which naturally brings us to the domino effect. How does a rumor in the Persian Gulf or a spike in a war risk premium actually turn into a dent in the listener's wallet?
The energy analysis lays out a really clear, somewhat terrifying timeline for how a shock like this unfolds. They say in the first hours it looks like an oil story, within days it looks like an inflation story, and within weeks it looks like a political story.
In those fourth hours, commodity traders immediately price in tighter supply. Refiners scramble for alternative sources. Governments start holding emergency meetings about releasing strategic reserves. But that's just the very first domino. It's mostly contained to financial terminals and situation rooms.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the focus always goes to crude oil, but we are also talking about liquefied natural gas, or LNG.
Crucial point.
The U.S. energy analysis emphasizes that a delay in LNG shipments or a massive spike in the cost to charter those specialized gas carriers hits electricity markets directly. It hits industrial production.
And eventually it lands right on your household energy bill, especially if you live in an import-dependent region in Europe or Asia.
Exactly.
Then we have to widen the lens even further to look at global supply chains. The risk analysis points out that modern supply chains are built for reliability, not for heroism.
Right. No room for error.
They rely on things arriving exactly when they're supposed to, using just-in-time delivery. When freight insurance spikes and vessels have to avoid certain routes, you get a massive reshuffling of risk. Companies realize their inventory buffers are too short.
So they panic by shipping capacity.
Yes, they have to pay premiums for faster alternative shipping, and they pass those new costs directly down the line.
It shows up everywhere. You wonder why airline tickets suddenly jump in price for a summer vacation, or why the cost of fertilizer goes up for farmers in the Midwest, which eventually makes the produce in your grocery store aisle more expensive. It reshapes the kitchen budget for ordinary families everywhere.
We can essentially break this macroeconomic fallout into four massive dominoes. Domino 1 is inflation driven by those broad transport and production cost increases we just traced. Domino 2 is monetary policy stress. Think about what a central bank actually does.
They adjust interest rates.
Right, their main tool is interest rates. If a shock in the strait sends inflation spiking, the textbook response is to raise rates to cool the economy down. But this isn't normal inflation driven by a booming economy. This is supply shock inflation.
Raising interest rates doesn't magically make ships sail through a dangerous strait any faster.
Exactly. It just makes mortgages and credit cards more expensive while people are already paying more for gas.
They are essentially trapped between risking a recession or letting inflation run hot.
A total lose-lose situation.
Mm.
Domino 3 is fiscal pressure. Governments often step in to subsidize fuel or electricity to prevent public unrest. They try to absorb the shock for the consumer, which puts a massive strain on national budgets.
And the last domino.
Domino 4 is credit conditions. Rising global uncertainty makes borrowing much more expensive for both businesses and governments. The capital needed to build houses, start businesses, or fund public works dries up. This is why the sources insist this isn't just an oil story. It is fundamentally a cost of living story.
And it's crucial to emphasize that this pain is incredibly uneven. It's a story about the distribution of economic pain. Lower-income households are hit the absolute hardest because energy and food made up a much larger percentage of their daily budgets. A 20% increase in fuel prices means skipping meals or defaulting on bills, and it hits specific regions disproportionately.
The reporting highlights Southeast Asia as a prime example. Take a country like Malaysia. Even if they produce some of their own energy, they're deeply exposed to these global price swings.
Everything costs more.
Right, they face higher shipping costs for imported goods, their manufacturing exports become more expensive to move, and their tourism operations take a massive hit because aviation fuel costs surge. Global geopolitics quickly turns into very localized, acute economic stress.
That localized stress leads to a really fascinating psychological framing from the source material. The analyst suggests we can look at Hormuz as a trust corridor. When the corridor is secure, society hums along quietly. But when it is threatened, distrust begins to spread. Distrust between citizens and their governments, between consumers and institutions.
It makes perfect sense when you consider how visible energy costs are. Nobody gets angry at the global supply chain when they buy a moderately overpriced avocado at the supermarket. The avocado doesn't have a giant glowing sign advertising its price to every passing car.
No, it doesn't.
But fuel prices are psychologically loud. You drive down the street and the prices are glowing on 50-foot tall signs. They're discussed every single day on the local news. For a lot of people, the price of gas is a daily, highly visible referendum on a government's competence.
And when those glowing numbers surge because of a distant conflict, governments have a nearly impossible time explaining to their citizens why they have to bear the cost of decisions being made thousands of miles away. That explanation gap is exactly where domestic narratives and disinformation thrive.
The political reporting shows how different factions will use these distant price spikes to push entirely different domestic agendas. You'll have one political camp framing the inflation as evidence of a massive foreign policy failure by the current administration.
And another group will use it to argue for something else entirely.
Exactly. Another group will use it to argue that the world is inherently hostile and requires massive increases in military spending. Others will say it proves we need to speed up the transition to green energy immediately, while some will use it as a reason to retreat from international trade altogether. The physical battlefield might be in the Gulf, but the narrative battlefields are in local elections everywhere.
Are we seeing a demographic split in how these narratives play out, based on the sources?
A very stark one. There's a profound generational divide in how these shocks are interpreted. Younger generations who are already dealing with anxiety over climate change and housing crises often see a Hormuz energy shock as proof that our dependence on fossil fuels is a direct existential security threat.
And older generations.
Meanwhile, older generations might look at the exact same event and see it as proof that the world is sliding into disorder and that traditional national strength and fossil fuel dominance has to take priority over globalization.
Let's pause on an invisible impact the reporting drilled down into because it's deeply human. We often think of geopolitics as states moving chess pieces. But think about the Gulf economies themselves. They run on massive expatriate workforces.
Huge numbers of people.
Right. If risk levels in the Strait get so high that regional projects pause or foreign investment cools down, that directly hits the paychecks of millions of workers. We're talking about families in South Asia and Southeast Asia who rely on those monthly remittances to pay for school fees or basic groceries.
A maritime choke point is literally dictating whether a teenager in a completely different hemisphere can afford to go to college next year.
It is the ultimate butterfly effect of global economic. So what does this all mean for the future? As we move away from fossil fuels, does a historical choke point like the Strait of Hormuz just fade into irrelevance?
The nature of its importance is shifting dramatically because of the modern weaponization of risk. The threats aren't just anti-ship missiles or traditional naval mines anymore.
It's more sophisticated now.
The security sources detail a new frontier of disruption. We're looking at cyber interference, shutting down the digital systems of port operations, or GPS spoofing that blinds commercial navigation systems, causing ships to wander into hostile waters.
Wow.
We are seeing the deployment of cheap drone swarms and the aggressive use of financial sanctions. Today, open water can be functionally closed simply by legal and reputational risk. If the compliance risk or the cyber risk is too high, companies just won't sail.
They just pull the plug on the route.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the global transition to new energy sources doesn't actually erase geopolitical risk. It simply moves it to new locations.
The map of global vulnerabilities is completely rewriting itself. We are moving toward a portfolio of new choke points. Instead of just worrying about oil and LNG at Hormuz, the security analysts are now looking at the vulnerability of undersea internet cables, which carry trillions of dollars in financial transactions.
And satellite networks.
Right. Satellite networks in low Earth orbit, the incredibly concentrated supply chains for rare earth minerals, and the highly specialized capacity to make semiconductor manufacturing tools. Wars are no longer just fought over physical territory, they're fought over system control.
System control is the defining concept for the next century. It's the ability to raise the cost of normal everyday life for your geopolitical rivals without ever declaring a direct war or crossing a border.
Which brings us to the ultimate lesson our sources have for policymakers today. And it's a sobering one. The absolute cheapest form of stability is prevention. But prevention is politically boring.
It rarely wins elections. True security looks like unglamorous things. It's diversified procurement strategies that take years to build. It's spending billions of dollars to maintain massive strategic reserves that you hope you never use.
It's treating energy security like social security.
Fundamentally, yes. Treating energy security and supply chain resilience as a form of social security. It's about building thick economic buffers so that a shock in the system doesn't immediately bankrupt ordinary families.
To wrap this all up, it's clear that the Strait of Hormuz casts a very wide shadow over the globe. When that shadow darkens, whether through actual conflict, credible threats, or just a simple miscalculation, the very first things to change are the market prices and the news headlines.
Absolutely.
But the very last things to change are our societies. And by the time those societal changes set in, fueled by inflation and distrust, they are incredibly hard to reverse.
It is a massive ripple effect.
We want to leave you with a final thought to mull over today. Our sources point out that the energy transition is slowly going to shift the world's focus away from oil choke points and toward critical minerals and digital networks.
The new map?
Right. So I want you to take a look at the smartphone or the laptop you are using to listen to us right now. If the Strait of Hormuz is the great valve for the fossil fuel era, where exactly are the invisible, unmapped Straits of Hormuz for the lithium sitting inside your battery or the data running through your cloud connection?
A really important question.
And perhaps more importantly, who has their hand on those valves today?